Hi, everyone. We are beside this very strange statue, but I really like it. A gift from India to the International Maritime Organization. And again, we've done a series of these videos now because this week has been actually one of the most crucial and important weeks in IMO history in terms of decarbonizing the maritime sector, the shipping industry itself. And we today have concluded by putting amendments to MARPOL Annex 6 into this text has been adopted by committee or brought into by committee. So I am here with David Barry. David Barry, he's a professor of international law and regional integration at the University of West Indies, the Cave Hill campus. And I have worked, I've never told you this, David, I have worked with Cave Hill campus for at least 10 years in the past because I used to do student exchanges for a tiny university in Morocco with them.
Wow.
Yeah, so it goes back a long way. So David's been working with Janice Remy, amongst other people in the Caribbean region, in order to work on this clean shipping lanes project, this Caribbean shipping lanes project. But the first thing I want to go into, because we have to, because what we've just witnessed is the bringing into text, a legal text, if you will. So perhaps you can maybe help us understand what exactly happened downstairs just now in the MEPC committee.
All right. Thanks. Well, we just adopted the text, and so it sets out the framework or skeleton for the measures. And what we're going to be doing in the next segment is adopting guidelines that'll go clearly through the text and elaborate and make the proper procedures and modes of implementing.
And what does that mean? Okay, so you've got this text. So basically we had a greenhouse gas strategy adopted in 2023. Now we have some movement forward, and we can judge the level of ambition in that movement, if you will. Maybe that's another question for you, David. But these guidelines, what does that mean? How are we going to implement this?
So the way it works, the IMO convention and the MARPOL convention.
MARPOL is the Marine Pollution Convention.
Yeah, they set out a core framework. They're quite detailed and quite technical in some parts, but nevertheless, there are some things that you need to work out in much more detail, and you set those out in guidelines. So the MARPOL Convention, the amendments we've made are binding legal text. The guidelines will be binding, but they can be easily amended, so we don't have to go through this process again. So there are many variables that have been set out formally in the legal text, but it's really like the skeleton. You have to put flesh on the structure. So you have to make sure you build out so that it can properly be implemented. Because right now you couldn't implement it per se, but what it does is it sends a clear signal. It's binding, and therefore when it's fully enforced, then it will allow states and the private sector to change their behavior accordingly. And the guidelines will go through the real details that are needed to set the different fuel standards and those kinds of things.
And these things are really hard to come. I've never honestly seen such a contentious negotiation as I have this week. And you were part of that negotiation, or you're advising in a technical capacity behind it.
Yeah, I was helping with the legal, but I was also kind of a translator because we had some really good technical experts who were doing economic modeling, and the language they would use, and the amendments were so complicated, and the language that they used was itself so complicated that what I tried to do is phrase it for our delegates in a way that could be understood and then acted upon and spoken to from the floor. And so that was a big part of my job, was to think about how to express or how to take a position on something that was developing on the floor. But the most interesting thing for me about these negotiations was the interlinked nature of it. And so many things had to come together in the right way. And if you move one thing out of it and it's not aligned, then the whole thing starts to fall apart. And so what we saw, the whole point of this was to create emission reduction. So we're trying to get to net zero by 2050 so that ships will not be polluting by 2050. But in order to do that, you have to encourage an energy transition, because they can't keep using diesel and somehow get miraculously to zero pollution. So you have to encourage the private sector to invest in these new fuels, which require huge new technology, major investments, et cetera. So you need to do that. We decided that the best way would be rewards. You reward those that are using those new fuels, which will be more expensive, which will require modification of vessels, modification of bunkering facilities, et cetera. So you reward them. But for the Caribbean, of course, our concern was not just helping the ship sector comply, because of course the ship sector tends to be owned by wealthy northern developed countries, but helping our own infrastructure comply. so our ports and other facilities. So a big part of the conversation was about, well, we have to raise enough money to ensure that we can get the ships to transition over and reach net zero by 2050, but in a way that leaves a level playing field where you don't have this disadvantaged areas of the world, and it has to lead to a just and equitable transition. So it has to be something that will not disproportionately burden, for example, Caribbean states. And so a lot of the back and forth was on those things. And as you can imagine, we had a huge discussion about one chapter, which was on revenue disbursement. The revenue disbursement just simply said, if we create a fund that receives taxes in a sense from various things, where is that money to be dispersed? To what categories of things can it be dispersed? And in the Caribbean, we were very concerned about that because we wanted it not only to go to rewards for ships, but also to go to the kinds of things we need funding for. So it could be port and infrastructure development. It could be seafarer training to deal with ammonia and dangerous fuels. It could be for environmental adaptation. And if you think about it, we all have to deal with sea level rise, and you can't have ships dock in ports that are underwater. So how are you going to make sure that you have ports that can accommodate the new conditions caused by, in part, the greenhouse gas emissions of shipping, because they were a major contributor. So we put a lot of emphasis on that, but that is only carries us so far because you have to have the funds in the fund to give us disbursements. And so you can see that there was a real tug and pull. So the thing I enjoyed perhaps most about this project was really looking at all the interlocking features of it, which were very complex. And once you understand the balances and the sort of economic structure that they had to put it into action, that became really interesting for me.
And I don't want to end on this note, but I must, because on Tuesday evening, the countries here, all of them, got a message from the United States government, for example, objecting in the strongest measures to any economic measure being put in place here at the IMO. That was basically the crux of a long message sent to delegations. That, combined with the contentiousness in the room of a certain bloc of states, for example, led by Saudi Arabia, that wanted to actually try to block the report from actually even being sent to committee, let alone, and then calling for a vote at committee. This really, really watered down kind of the ambition in the room.
Yeah, it's hard to say how much was watered down by the U.S. interventions, but you're right. The geopolitics going on right now made this conversation much more difficult than it ordinarily would have. So you have the instability of all the tariffs imposed by the U.S. regime, and then direct instructions from the U.S. government not to continue with these kind of activities that we were doing. But I must say I'm very proud of the Caribbean and really all the states who participated, which is that we didn't stop the negotiations.
No.
And you can't. I mean, this was a goal we had set ourselves in 2023, which is to move to net zero by 2050. And we had spent years negotiating it. And so we can't just stop. But I think it did have, unfortunately, a chilling effect. And so it may have shifted sort of pressures in the room in a certain way. But I don't know. I don't know what was going through all the delegate minds.
Sure.
But I was very proud that we did continue to negotiate. And remember, it's always a difficult balance. So if you're negotiating against, say, a European country that has a lot of ships, then their interests are different from us because they own the ships, they control the ships, so they want money to.
And they have the money to decarbonize.
And they have the money to decarbonize anyway. But they want the money to go into shipping and retrofitting ships, whereas we're not as concerned with that in the Caribbean because we don't own them. And so in that kind of sense, then for us, there's a different emphasis. And I think that the interesting thing was that there were clear coalitions. I think the Caribbean did very well. We were united quite well. The Pacific group was very united. The Europeans, I always felt there was some that were kind of trying to go outside of the grouping. And so that was very interesting to sort of see the movements back and forth. But they try to present a united front, but I think internally there are disagreements and tensions. And maybe that played out because of the pressure from the outside world. It played out to modify their position a little bit. But we thank all the states that were able to support the Caribbean and the Pacific group of states. And I think we did get the final vote had a lot more abstentions than I would have thought. And I think some of those abstentions were supporting Saudi Arabia, which said we shouldn't do any of this. But I think some of the abstentions were supporting the Pacific group of states that said that, yes, the text we have is a step forward, but it's a teeny baby step forward. And what we wanted was something much, much better. And so the Pacific also was upset with the process a lot of their submissions were simply not included in any text, that they were excluded. And I think the Caribbean felt similar about some of those things, although we had the mandate to vote, so we voted.
Yeah, I mean, look, we've been here before. We know that in these multilateral international or negotiations of any type, you come in, you have your agendas, you have your mandates from capital. This is what happens. You don't deviate from that, or it's very difficult to deviate from this. I think something just to end on look, this is not, I don't want to end on a U.S. Trump positive note, but we've been here before. We've seen international agreements. We've seen them pull out of international agreements, and not just Trump, other past U.S. Administrations as well, right? This isn't new news. And so I think the idea, that's not what I think, us as a global community down there with varying degrees of ambition, pushing forward on this agenda is really, really important. And we're going to see that in the future. Well, I hope so.
Yes, I think so. And I think the IMO is, it has its own working methods, but I think because it's technical, I think that allows us to maybe move forward a bit more than when you're talking UNFCCC or general climate change things. And because we're technical, we're focused on concrete things, and hopefully we'll be able to move a little bit further faster.
I always say when you work like me on something as nebulous as climate change, that we're trying to save the planet, it's nice to go into a ship, into a port and see, you know what, we can do this. This is how you do this. And we actually have the technical knowledge there. So we have we have everything we need to move forward. We just have to do it better. David, thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to what you've been doing behind the scenes here. It's really important.
Thank you very much.